Title: The Haunting of Violet Harper. Prologue: The Invitation. There are places in this world that exist outside the reach of reason. Places where time and space bend, where the rules of nature seem to crumble, and where the boundaries between life and death blur into an endless, suffocating fog. They are the forgotten corners of the earth, tucked away where the sun seldom shines, where even the wind hesitates to blow. They are the places that no one speaks of, places that are never marked on maps, places that call to the lost, the curious, the desperate. One such place is the house on the hill. It had stood for as long as anyone could remember, its dark silhouette cutting through the sky like the jagged edge of a nightmare. People who lived nearby spoke of it in hushed tones, their voices trembling with a kind of fear that ran deeper than simple superstition. Children dared each other to go near, but none ever ventured too close. The air around the house seemed to hum with an unspoken warning, and anyone who had been foolish enough to ignore it never returned the same. Some didn't return at all. The house on the hill wasn't just a house. It was a thing that hungered. It wasn't simply a structure of wood and stone. It was alive in a way that defied explanation. It had a presence, a consciousness, a mind of its own. And once you were near it, it would know you, it would see you, and then it would call to you. They said the house chose its victims carefully. Those who were lost, those who were broken, those whose hearts and minds were already fractured. It whispered to them in their dreams, coaxing them toward the darkness, leading them to the doorstep, promising them salvation, release from their suffering. It promised them peace, but the house never gave what it promised. It gave something else. Violet was one of those who heard the call. She didn't believe in ghosts or haunted houses or any of the stories she had heard growing up. She was pragmatic, rooted in reality, a woman of logic and reason. But her life had been fractured by loss. The death of her parents, the collapse of her marriage, a life full of broken pieces that she didn't know how to put back together. One night, as the weight of her grief pressed down on her chest, she heard the whisper. It was faint at first, a soft rustling in the back of her mind, like the fluttering of distant wings, but it grew louder, clearer. A voice, deep, ancient, and knowing, called out to her from the darkness. "Come closer," it whispered like a lover's promise. "You are lost. We can fix that. We can help you. Come home." Violet wasn't sure why she listened. Maybe it was the exhaustion of living a life that felt like an endless cycle of pain. Maybe it was the longing for something, anything to change. She didn't know. All she knew was that the voice spoke to something inside her, something broken and aching, and she could not resist. And so, she went. The journey to the house was the beginning of the end. She traveled alone, unaware that the path she walked was leading her deeper into a web that had already been spun. It was a road that twisted, turned, and beckoned her forward, though she couldn't see where it ended. She had no idea what waited for her at the end of that road, no idea that the house was not just a place, but an entity, ancient and hungry, that would consume her in ways she could not understand. The house was waiting for her, and once it had her, there would be no escape. And this opening sets up the mystery of the house and Violet's tragic descent, drawing the reader in with an air of dread and inevitability. The house is presented not just as a building, but as a living force, something ancient and powerful that actively seeks out its victims. Violet, with her fractured life and broken spirit, is the perfect target, and her decision to venture into the house marks the start of a nightmarish journey she cannot return from. Chapter 1. The Disappearance. The house stood like a sentinel at the edge of the town, its jagged silhouette casting long shadows across the darkened landscape. Violet Harper didn't know why she had chosen it, or perhaps in a way she did. The house had been abandoned for years, tucked away from the bustling center of town, left to decay in its solitude. It had been so easy to forget, and Violet, in her grief and desperation, had found that a place forgotten by others might offer her the same anonymity she craved. Violet had moved in 2 months ago, after the end of her marriage, the end of Charles. His disappearance, a year ago, still felt too fresh, too raw, despite the empty passage of time. She had tried to convince herself that she could outrun the silence that had haunted her since he vanished, But now, in this house, alone and distant from everything she once knew, the silence was heavier. It pressed on her chest like an unseen weight, and though the house was large, spacious even, she couldn't escape it. The house smelled old, familiar in its musty way, but with something deeper. It was a scent that clung to the walls, seeped into the floors, and lingered in the stale air. It was a smell that did not belong to any one thing, not dust or dampness, but a more elusive presence, like the remnants of forgotten lives. She often woke in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling, feeling the very air shift around her, as though the house itself was alive, slowly breathing, quietly shifting, perhaps even watching her. Her mind played tricks on her at night. The house would creak in a way that seemed deliberate, a faint rattle of chains in the distance. A door that had never been opened before creaked and groaned, as if some force from the other side was testing its hinges. Violet told herself that these noises were only the house settling. But after a while, the house's whispers felt too deliberate, too haunting to dismiss. Violet couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That this house, this place she had hoped would offer her solace, was instead pulling her further into some unseen nightmare. The house had been Charles's idea. When they had first seen it years ago, before everything had gone wrong, they had fallen in love with its potential, its old-world charm and grandeur, its promise of something they could restore together. They had spoken of renovations, of turning it into a dream home, but those plans had never come to fruition. Charles had always been obsessed with the past, history, antiques, the occult. Violet had chalked it up to harmless interest at first, but as the years wore on, his obsession deepened, became darker. He spent hours buried in books she couldn't even begin to understand. Ancient texts, obscure rituals, forgotten beliefs. He had told her one evening over dinner that he was looking for answers. She hadn't questioned him then, believing it was just a phase, some strange academic pursuit. But when he began speaking of reaching beyond the veil, of contacting those on the other side, Violet grew uneasy. "I'm doing it for us," he had said, his eyes feverish, distant. "If I can bring back the lost, I'll find a way for us to understand." But Violet had never fully understood what he meant. And then, one day, just like that, he was gone. Violet's recollections of that day were fragmented, distorted. She had awoken in the morning to an empty bed, the side next to hers still warm, but the sheets untouched. At first she thought he had gotten up early, gone for a walk, or maybe headed to the library. But as hours passed and he didn't return, she began to worry. Then the hours turned into days, and the police were called. They had scoured the town, checked his usual haunts. Nothing. His car was found abandoned on the outskirts of town, parked off the road in a place they had never been before, and there were no signs of struggle. No note, no goodbye. Just gone. The search continued for weeks, but Charles was never found. There were no clues, no indication of what had happened to him. The police had run out of leads, and no one seemed to care anymore. The town went on with its life, while Violet was left behind to pick up the pieces of a life shattered by a disappearance that made no sense. But the rumors, the whispers, those began shortly after. Violet hadn't wanted to believe them at first, had dismissed them as idle gossip, something people said to fill the void when there was no real explanation for something. But there was one person, Mrs. Simmons, the neighbour who lived 2 doors down, who always seemed to know more than she should. She had told Violet that Charles had been acting strange in the months leading up to his disappearance. She'd overheard him talking late into the night with someone. She had seen him pacing the front yard, muttering to himself in a language Violet couldn't recognize. There were even rumors that Charles had been involved in some sort of occult practice, that he had been seeking out ancient rituals to make contact with the dead. At first, Violet had laughed it off. Her husband wasn't the superstitious type. He was just a man lost in his studies. He wasn't dabbling in dark arts. He couldn't have been. But the longer she stayed in their old home, the more those rumors began to claw at her mind. What if Charles had found something he shouldn't have? What if his disappearance wasn't just a result of his obsession, but of something more sinister, something that had taken him away, something he had called forth? That was the reason she had left. That was the reason she had come here, to this old house, alone in the middle of nowhere. She had told herself it was for a fresh start, a way to escape the painful memories of a life lost. But in truth, she was running from more than just the memories of Charles. She was running from something she couldn't fully comprehend. The house, with its creaking walls and long, dark hallways, offered no comfort. It only deepened her unease. At night, the darkness seemed to press in on her from every side. No matter how many lights she turned on, no matter how many doors she closed, the feeling of being watched never ceased. It was as if the house itself had a pulse, a rhythm, and it was alive, waiting for her to slip up, to reveal a weakness. One evening, unable to shake the oppressive atmosphere, Violet took a walk through the house, as if exploring it would somehow make it feel more like home. She avoided the basement at first, knowing that she had no business venturing into that dark, forgotten space. But the door to it had always intrigued her. Locked for years, hidden behind a pile of boxes, as though someone had gone to great lengths to keep it closed. Her fingers trembled slightly as she fumbled through the kitchen drawers. The old brass key was buried at the bottom, forgotten, as though it had no purpose anymore. Violet hesitated before she took it in her hand and walked toward the basement door. It creaked open with a groan that seemed louder than it should have been, reverberating in the thick silence of the house. The basement was cold, damp with the scent of mold and decay. The air felt thick, cloying, as though the very space beneath the house had been holding its breath for years. She stepped carefully, each footstep echoing off the stone walls. The flickering light of the lantern she carried cast long, trembling shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. At the far end of the basement, in the center of the floor, she saw it. A circle, drawn in chalk, symbols she couldn't recognize, too complex, too foreign to make sense of. At the heart of the circle lay a blackened candle, its wick shriveled and dark, as though it had been burnt out long ago. A chill ran down Violet's spine as she realized what she was looking at. It was a ritual circle, and Charles had been here. He had been here, trying to do something that had consumed him completely. The thought of it made her stomach churn. Had he tried to summon something? Had he brought this curse into the house with him? Her eyes darted around the room, the whispers growing louder, curling at the edges of her thoughts. Violet! Her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. Chapter 2. The Unseen Forces Expanded. Violet Harper had been a skeptic all her life, dismissing tales of haunted houses and supernatural forces as nothing more than the overactive imaginations of those who had nothing better to do. But this house, this forsaken, decaying mansion, had begun to erode her disbelief. The longer she stayed within its crumbling walls, the more she felt the house becoming something alive, and it was beginning to grow restless. Since the night she had discovered the ritual circle in the basement, she couldn't stop thinking about what she had seen. The strange symbols, the dark energy pulsing in the air, and the overwhelming sense of dread had all left an indelible mark on her. Every night she would lie in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, unable to sleep, as the shadows seemed to twist and writhe at the edges of her vision. It was as if something was always waiting, hidden just beyond her reach. And then there were the whispers. They started so faintly that Violet thought she might have imagined them. At first it was just a distant murmur, like voices carried on the wind. But gradually, they grew louder, clearer, as if the house itself were trying to communicate with her. Sometimes she would hear her name being called, in a voice that sounded vaguely like Charles, though distorted and hollow. Other times it was just a jumble of incoherent words, the language foreign to her ears, but still somehow familiar. Every time she tried to focus on them, they would retreat, dissolving into the silence of the house, leaving behind a lingering sense of unease. Violet tried to ignore it. She told herself that she was just stressed, grieving the loss of Charles, dealing with the isolation of living alone in such a sprawling, empty place. But deep down, she knew something else was at play, something dark, something alive. The first sign. It was on the third day after the ritual discovery that the book first appeared. Violet had spent most of the morning cleaning the drawing room, dusting off old furniture and trying to make the space feel less oppressive. The air inside the house felt stagnant, as if it hadn't moved in years. The windows were all shut, and the curtains drawn. But no matter how much she cleaned, the room never seemed to lose its musty, suffocating atmosphere. It was during her second sweep through the room that she noticed the book. It was lying open on the coffee table, exactly in the spot she had left it earlier that morning. Violet frowned. She had definitely closed it before she'd left to fetch some cleaning supplies. She had no memory of leaving it open, let alone placing it back on the table. In fact, she couldn't remember touching it since the night she had found it in the basement. A chill ran through her as she approached the table, her fingers instinctively brushing the edges of the leather cover. It was unnaturally cold to the touch, as if it had been in the icebox, rather than sitting in a room bathed in sunlight. The book's pages fluttered open in her hands as if someone had been turning them. The symbols and diagrams within the pages were the same as those in the basement, a disturbing reminder of the ritual she had witnessed. Each page seemed to contain an image or symbol she could almost recognize, but when she tried to focus on it, the meaning slipped away like water through her fingers. She couldn't stop herself. She began to turn the pages, her fingers trembling with both fear and curiosity. There was something compelling about the book, something that felt wrong. It was as if the book were calling to her, whispering, urging her to continue. Suddenly the whispers grew louder, more distinct. "Violet, come closer." She froze. The voice, it was unmistakable. It sounded like Charles, but it was twisted, hollow, like a ghost calling from the other side. With a shudder, Violet slammed the book shut, almost dropping it in her haste. The room felt colder now, the oppressive silence creeping back in. For a moment she just stood there, staring at the book as it lay motionless on the table. What was happening to her? She couldn't trust herself anymore. The house was playing tricks on her mind. It had to be. She had to be imagining things. But as she glanced around the room, the chill didn't subside. She could feel it now, a presence, a weight in the air. Something was watching her. Violet left the drawing room abruptly, the echoes of her footsteps reverberating in the hollow emptiness. She hurried to the kitchen, hoping the mundane act of making tea would help settle her nerves. But even there, she felt it. The oppressive feeling that the house was closing in on her. The attic. The feeling intensified the next day when Violet heard the thud. It was the kind of sound that might have been easily dismissed under normal circumstances, just a muffled bump, like the sound of something heavy falling onto the floor. But it wasn't normal. The sound came from above, from the attic. Violet hadn't ventured into the attic since moving in. It was a place she had avoided, locked behind a creaky door at the end of a narrow hallway. The last time she'd been up there, the air had been thick with dust, the floorboards creaking ominously underfoot. But there had never been any sign of life, just old forgotten furniture and broken antiques, the kind of things that no one cared about anymore. But this was different. The thuds continued, rhythmic now, slow, measured. At first, Violet thought it might be an animal, a raccoon or some other creature that had found its way inside. But there was something too deliberate about the noise. It didn't sound random or chaotic, like an animal trying to find its way out. It sounded like someone walking slowly, methodically, pacing back and forth. And it was coming from the attic. Her breath caught in her throat. No one was in the attic. She was alone. Violet stood in the hallway, her heart thudding in her chest as she listened. The sound continued for a few more moments, and then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. But it wasn't a comforting silence. It was the kind of silence that stretched on too long, too thick to be real. Violet stood frozen, listening, her body trembling. After what felt like an eternity, she finally mustered the courage to make her way to the attic door. She reached out to turn the knob, but her hand stopped inches from the cold brass. The door felt as though it was alive, as though it were breathing with her. But it was locked. She was sure of it. Violet's mind raced. What had she just heard? Had it been real? Was it just the house settling? Or had something, really been up there? Gathering her strength, she unlocked the door. The soft click of the latch loud in the silence. The air hit her as she opened the door, a thick, musty smell that carried with it the scent of old wood and forgotten memories. Stepping inside, she immediately noticed the change. The air felt colder here, even colder than the rest of the house. The temperature dropped by several degrees, and Violet's breath came out in visible puffs of air. The attic was cluttered with old boxes, forgotten furniture, and tarps covering what appeared to be large objects. But something caught her eye, an old, full-length mirror in the corner, half covered by a dusty sheet. Her heart raced as she approached the mirror. There was something wrong about it. The frame was intricately carved with strange symbols that seemed familiar, but she couldn't place them. It was almost identical to the symbols in the book. Her fingers tingled as she reached out to touch it. As her hand brushed the glass, a sudden feeling of nausea washed over her. The room around her seemed to distort, the walls stretching, the ceiling bending, and the shadows flickering unnaturally. Violet staggered backward, but her reflection didn't move with her. It stayed, frozen in the mirror. But as she stared into it, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Behind her in the reflection was someone else. A shadow. Tall, looming, impossibly dark. It was almost human, but not quite. The figure stood motionless, just out of the frame, as if watching her. But when she whipped around to look, there was nothing there. No one. Just the empty, dusty attic. Her breathing quickened. Violet felt dizzy. She stepped back from the mirror, her hands trembling. But the whispers began again, louder now. The voice was familiar. Charles's voice, but twisted, dark, distant. Violet. You are so close. Violet wanted to scream, but her voice was caught in her throat. The mirror beckoned her, and despite every instinct in her mind telling her to run, she stepped closer to it. She had to know. Further expansion and themes. In this expanded chapter, the atmosphere continues to build, as Violet's interactions with the house grow more oppressive and unsettling. The book reappears, almost as if it has a mind of its own, and the mirror, with its strange symbols, becomes a focal point of both terror and fascination. The supernatural presence begins to manifest more clearly, both in physical disturbances, the noises from the attic, and psychological ones, the haunting whispers and distorted reflections. As the chapter progresses, Violet's grip on reality begins to falter, pushing her toward the edge of madness as she grows more consumed by the mysterious forces around her. Chapter 3. The Unraveling Mind. The next morning, Violet awoke to an oppressive silence that hung thick in the air. She couldn't shake the lingering sensations from the night before, the feeling of being watched, the ever-present whispers that tugged at the edge of her mind, the events in the attic, the cold touch of the mirror, and the shadow she saw behind her reflection. They played on a constant loop in her thoughts, refusing to let her rest. She had no idea how long she had been lying there in the dark, but the sun was already high, casting pale light through the blinds. For a moment, it almost felt like everything was normal again. The weight of the night before seemed to have lifted, and the house appeared still, as if nothing had happened. But when she swung her legs off the bed, her bare feet hit the cold wooden floor, and the air around her thickened again. The whispers were there, just beneath the surface, as if they had been waiting for her to stir. She tried to ignore them. She had to. She couldn't let herself be consumed by the madness that seemed to seep from every crack and corner of the house. She dressed quickly, moving mechanically through her routine, as if going through the motions would give her some sense of control. But it didn't. It never did. When she reached the kitchen, the sense of dread only deepened. The morning light filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the table, yet everything felt wrong. The walls seemed to close in. The silence was too profound, and the hum of the house had ceased entirely. For a moment, Violet could almost believe that the house itself had stopped breathing, waiting, listening. The phone on the counter buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was an email, a message from the lawyer handling Charles's estate. The subject line read, "Urgent. Finalization of estate and immediate action required." Violet hadn't wanted to deal with the estate. She hadn't wanted to face the reality that Charles was gone, leaving her alone in this suffocating house, where the past seemed to cling to every surface. But she knew it had to be done. She had to finish what had been started, tie up the loose ends, and somehow regain control of her life. As she opened the email, the words blurred before her eyes. The message was standard: property details, tax information, things she had expected. But then she saw it. A line buried at the bottom. almost as an afterthought. There have been reports of unusual occurrences on the property. It is advised that you remain cautious during the process. The email gave no further context, no explanation of what unusual occurrences meant. It was an innocuous enough line, but to Violet, it felt like an indictment, as if Charles's lawyer knew something she didn't, something about the house that no one had spoken of aloud. Violet pushed the phone away, her pulse quickening. She had never believed in ghosts or spirits, but the longer she stayed in this house, the more her skepticism began to crack. She could feel it, the malevolent force, the presence that seemed to permeate every inch of the building. The whispers were getting louder now, a persistent drone in the back of her mind, growing clearer with each passing day. Violet. She stood abruptly, knocking her chair back with a loud scrape. Her eyes darted around the kitchen, but there was nothing there, just the usual mundane trappings of daily life. The coffee pot on the counter, the half-eaten plate of toast, but the air felt heavy, thick with something intangible, something dark. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat and left the house. She needed to breathe. She needed to escape the oppressive weight of the house, of the isolation, if only for a moment. She found herself driving aimlessly, her mind a tangled mess of thoughts and fragmented memories. Her destination was unclear. She had no particular place to go, only the need to run from the creeping fear that had taken root in her chest. She ended up at the local cafe, the one Charles had taken her to on lazy weekends when the world seemed simpler, quieter. As she walked inside, the warm aroma of coffee hit her like a balm. For a fleeting moment, it felt as though everything could be normal again, but the sense of dread didn't leave her. It followed her, clinging to her like a shadow. She ordered her coffee and sat at a small table by the window, watching the world move outside as she tried to quiet the storm in her head. But the moment she settled, the sensation of being watched returned. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was there, just beyond the reach of her sight, watching her every move. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, so loud that they drowned out the normal cafe sounds. The clinking of cups, the low murmur of conversation. Violet. The voice was clearer now, unmistakably Charles's, though something was wrong. It sounded like he was right behind her, but when she turned around, there was no one there. The people in the cafe were going about their business, oblivious to her terror. Violet, why are you running? Her hands shook, the coffee cup clattering as it slid from her grasp, spilling across the table. The cafe felt impossibly still, like the entire world was holding its breath. She stood abruptly, knocking over her chair. She didn't care. She had to leave. She had to get back to the house. She returned home, her mind reeling from the voices, the feeling of someone following her. The air inside the house was thick with unease as she stepped through the front door. But something was different now. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full, full of something alive. The reappearance of the book. The moment she stepped into the drawing room, Violet's breath caught in her throat. The book was there again, lying open on the coffee table, just as it had been before. But this time, it wasn't just the strange symbols that greeted her. No, this time, the pages were filled with something else. The drawings weren't just symbols. They were faces. They were faces she recognized. Her own face, Charles's, even the faces of people from her past. But they were distorted, twisted, as though they had been pulled out of some nightmare. Her hands trembled as she reached for the book, the voices in her head screaming at her to stop, to leave it alone. But she couldn't. Her fingers hovered over the page. The faces stared back at her, their eyes hollow, their mouths twisted in silent screams. And then she saw it. Her own face, smiling at her from the page. A smile that wasn't hers. It wasn't her. The whispers turned into a cacophony, louder, more insistent, a chorus of voices rising from the book. Come closer, Violet. Come closer. Her heart pounded in her chest, her body frozen in place as the room seemed to darken. The walls closed in on her, the floor beneath her feet feeling unsteady. She stumbled back, slamming the book shut, but the noise in her mind didn't stop. It was as if the house itself had come alive, its voice echoing in her skull. Violet. The whispers shifted again, now too clear to ignore. You're not alone here. You're not alone. Violet's knees gave way, and she collapsed onto the floor, clutching her head as the voices screamed, pressing in on her from all directions. The house groaned around her, its very bones creaking as if something was moving within the walls. She scrambled to her feet, desperate to escape the madness, but she didn't know where to go. There was nowhere to run. The house was inside her mind now. She staggered toward the door, but before she could reach the threshold, she heard it. A sound from the hallway, faint but unmistakable. A thud. Another, and then a third. It was the sound of footsteps. She wasn't alone. Violet turned slowly, her breath caught in her throat as she faced the hallway. The shadows in the corners seemed to lengthen, stretch toward her, as if they were alive, reaching for her. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure standing at the end of the hallway, just beyond the darkness. It was her reflection, but not quite. The figure in the dark smiled at her, a smile that was not her own, and behind it, the faint outline of something else moved, something large and formless, rising from the shadows. Violet's world shattered. Further expansion and themes. In Chapter 3, Violet's psychological state continues to deteriorate as she confronts the terrifying power of the house. The whispers grow louder, and the house seems to manipulate her perceptions of reality. The presence of Charles, or a twisted version of him, becomes more pronounced as Violet sees his face in the book, hears his distorted voice, and feels as though he is following her. The figure she sees at the end of the hallway suggests that whatever is haunting her is not simply a figment of her imagination. It is something far more powerful, and it wants her. Chapter 4. Beneath the surface. The house had become a living thing. It breathed. It moaned. It whispered. Each morning when Violet awoke, she could feel it watching her, its unseen eyes following her every move. The sense of being suffocated was constant, like the walls were closing in around her, tightening with every passing hour. And no matter where she went, the whispers, the voices, were there, lurking just beneath the surface of her thoughts. The events from the night before had only worsened her already fragile state. The mirror in the attic, its warped reflection, its twisted smile, had unsettled her in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. When Violet closed her eyes, she could still see it. The face in the glass wasn't hers. It was another version of herself, smiling at her with an expression that was foreign, malevolent. That night, she had dreamt of it again. She had dreamt of the mirror calling to her, pulling her in, its jagged edges like a mouth opening wide to swallow her whole. But when she had woken up, the house seemed still, the kind of stillness that was almost suffocating. The whispering had stopped, for a while at least. Violet had told herself that she was imagining it, that it was just the stress, the isolation getting to her. But deep down, she knew she wasn't imagining it. The house had changed. It wasn't the same as it had been when Charles was alive. It felt alive now, alive in a way that was wrong, unnatural. Even the air felt different, heavy, dense with something Violet couldn't quite put her finger on. Something wrong. She moved slowly through the house, avoiding the rooms that made her feel too exposed, too vulnerable. The parlor was one of those rooms. She had avoided it for days now, unable to stand the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her when she stepped inside. But today, something compelled her to walk into it. It was as if the house had called her there, urging her forward. She stopped at the doorframe, gazing at the room. The sunlight filtered in through the tall windows, casting faint golden beams across the floor. There was a sense of stillness to it, like everything was holding its breath. The old grand piano in the corner of the room, the draped curtains, the worn rugs, everything looked untouched, as if waiting for something to break the silence. But the silence felt wrong. Her eyes wandered to the walls, where the family portraits hung, their faces staring down at her. They seemed to follow her with their eyes, their expressions unreadable. Violet couldn't help but feel that they were waiting for something, watching her. She stepped forward, her footfalls muffled by the thick carpet, and as she approached the old fireplace, something caught her eye. A piece of paper, crumpled and half hidden beneath one of the chairs. Her heart skipped. Violet bent down, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. The paper was yellowed with age, and the writing on it was scrawled in a hurried, almost frantic hand. "Come to the attic. The mirror is calling for you." Violet's breath caught in her throat. Her pulse quickened, and a strange wave of nausea washed over her. The handwriting was familiar, but she couldn't place it. The attic, the mirror. She had tried to forget about it, tried to ignore the pull it had on her, but she couldn't. The house was telling her to go there, to confront whatever it was that had been waiting in the darkness. She stood there for a long moment, the paper trembling in her grasp as the whispers returned, soft at first, then growing louder, more insistent, until they were a cacophony inside her head. "Violet, come closer." With a start, she snapped out of her daze, and before she knew it, her feet were already moving toward the door. The attic. She had to go back. She had to know. The journey to the attic, the stairs creaked beneath her as she ascended. Each step felt like an eternity, the old wood groaning in protest, echoing through the silence. It was as though the house was aware of her intentions, reluctant to let her ascend, but powerless to stop her. The walls seemed to close in around her as she reached the top, the air growing colder, thicker. The attic was dark, lit only by a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. Shadows stretched and shifted as though they had a life of their own, warping in unnatural ways. The door to the attic creaked as she pushed it open. The space beyond was as she remembered it, cluttered with old boxes, forgotten relics of a past life. Dust clung to every surface, the air thick with the musty smell of things left undisturbed for too long. But today, the air felt heavier, charged, as if something had changed. Her gaze fell immediately to the far corner of the room, where the mirror stood. The same mirror she had seen before, the same one that had twisted her reflection into something monstrous. She froze, her blood running cold as she stared at the mirror. It was the same as it had been the night before, yet there was something different about it now. The cracks in the glass had deepened overnight, the dark veins of them spreading like lightning through the frame. The reflection was blurry, out of focus, as though the glass was struggling to hold the image of reality. For a long moment, Violet stood there, unable to move. The whispers had quieted now, but something far worse had replaced them. The mirror felt like a living thing, like it was watching her, waiting for her to make the first move. She could feel the air around her crackling with tension, the very fabric of the room vibrating with some unseen force. Then, the glass rippled, just slightly, a shimmer. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible, but Violet's breath caught in her throat as she stepped forward, drawn in against her will. Her eyes were locked on her reflection, her breath shallow. The figure in the mirror shifted, the features distorting, reshaping, until Violet no longer recognized the woman standing there. It wasn't her. The reflection was distorted, a grotesque mockery of herself. Her eyes were hollow, like black voids, and her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, far too wide to be human. Violet's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She wanted to look away, but her body refused to obey. "Come closer." The voice, her voice, whispered from the mirror. But it was wrong. It wasn't the soft voice of her own mind anymore. It was deeper, darker, almost malevolent. The air around her grew colder, suffocating, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch forward, crawling toward her like living tendrils. The whispers in her head became deafening, rising to a crescendo. She could hear them now, not just in her mind, but from the mirror, from the walls, from everywhere. The house itself seemed to pulse with the voices, an endless torrent of demands, of pleas. "Violet!" She stepped forward, her body moving of its own accord. The mirror was pulling her in. Her fingers reached toward the glass, trembling, and as soon as her hand made contact with the surface, a sharp, icy pain shot through her, as if she were being dragged into the glass itself. The room around her began to blur, twisting and warping. The shadows stretched toward her like fingers, and the mirror seemed to open before her. It was no longer just a reflection. It was a doorway, a gateway. "Come closer, Violet. Join us." Her vision swam. The edges of the room began to dissolve into nothingness, and the mirror grew larger, swallowing her whole. She screamed, but the sound was muffled, as if the house was swallowing her voice as well. Her hand was still pressed against the glass. Her heart raced in her chest as the air grew thicker, the walls closing in around her, the voices growing louder, more desperate. And then suddenly, there was a pull, an overwhelming force yanking her forward. Violet felt herself being dragged into the glass, her body fighting against it. But it was futile. She was sinking, falling into the depths of the mirror, into the darkness beyond. And just before everything went black, she heard one final whisper. It's time. A shift in reality. Violet awoke with a violent start. Her body was trembling, covered in cold sweat. She was no longer in the attic. She wasn't even sure where she was. The room around her was unfamiliar, dark, and disorienting. The floor was cold beneath her, and her body ached from an unknown impact. Her heart raced as she slowly pushed herself to her feet. The mirror, the whispers, the voices. Her head spun as she tried to make sense of what had happened. Had she crossed over? Had she entered whatever dark world lay beyond the mirror? Was she even still in the house? Her eyes darted around the dim room, but everything was distorted, like a bad dream. The walls were slick with moisture, and the shadows seemed to move, alive with intent. She staggered to the window, but when she tried to look outside, there was nothing. The window was a reflection of her own face, pale, hollow-eyed, with an expression she didn't recognize. And then, in the reflection, she saw it. Her reflection smiled at her, a twisted, cruel smile. And for the first time, Violet understood the truth. She wasn't alone in the house. Chapter 5. The Broken Path. Violet's senses were frayed, like a piece of fabric unraveling at the seams. Each heartbeat echoed in her chest like a drumbeat of impending doom. She had crossed the threshold. She had entered the mirror, and now there was no turning back. The air was thick here, suffocating in its stillness, as though the very atmosphere were holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for her. There was no sound, save for the occasional creak of the house, its bones groaning under the weight of time and forgotten secrets. The walls around her were soft, damp, and a faint smell of mold and rot clung to the air. It wasn't just the house that felt off. It was everything. The floor beneath her feet felt uncertain, as though it were made of something other than wood or stone. It was unstable, shifting, as if the house itself were alive, breathing, pulsating with a strange energy. Her pulse quickened as the weight of her surroundings pressed in on her. The walls seemed to close in with every step she took, and the shadows stretched like arms, following her every movement. They whispered to her, their voices faint but unmistakable. The air around her seemed to hum with a malignant presence, and the whispers grew louder like a distant chorus, beckoning her towards something, or someone. Violet. She froze. The voice was so clear this time, so real. It wasn't a figment of her imagination, or the product of her overtaxed mind. It was coming from inside the walls. She could feel it, deep in her chest, like a vibration in her bones. It called her name with a chilling familiarity, like something she should know, but couldn't quite place. Something was trying to remind her of something. The house. This house. It was awake now, and it was hungry. Her head spun, the dizziness so overwhelming that she stumbled, gripping the wall for support. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted, forming shapes that were not quite human, figures that lurked just at the edge of her vision, their movements jerky, unnatural. They were not alive, but they weren't quite dead either. They were something else, something between worlds. Something that only existed in the spaces where reality blurred into something darker, something incomprehensible. And then there was the door, a door that had not been there when she first entered the room. It appeared in the far corner, as if it had always been there, waiting for her to notice it. The wood of the door was ancient, cracked, and weathered with age. Dark iron hinges glinted in the dim light, a grotesque invitation to step through. The shadows around it writhed, pulling at her like invisible hands, urging her forward. Come closer. Violet's fingers twitched involuntarily as her body moved toward the door. It was as if the door itself was pulling her, its energy magnetic, irresistible. She wanted to stop. She wanted to turn around, to run, but she couldn't. The house had already claimed her. She had already crossed the line. As her hand touched the cold brass knob, the door creaked open with a sound that echoed through the silent house. The room beyond was dark, impossibly dark. The shadows in the corridor stretched long and impossibly deep, as though the darkness itself had substance, like it was a living thing. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, like stepping into a place where time itself had forgotten to exist. And yet, there was a flicker of something that beckoned her forward, something alive. Violet stepped through the door, for the room beyond. The moment she crossed the threshold, a wave of dizziness washed over her. It was as though the world around her tilted slightly, just enough to disorient her, to make her question what was real. The room she found herself in was not a room at all, but a space that stretched beyond the limits of reason. The walls seemed to bend inwards, like the inside of a great, hollow sphere. The floor beneath her feet was uneven, cracked, as if it had not been touched by human hands in centuries. She took a tentative step forward, her eyes scanning the room, trying to make sense of the madness unfolding around her. The space was bathed in an eerie, unnatural light, the source of which she could not discern. It flickered and pulsed like a heartbeat, casting long shadows that danced unnaturally across the walls. And then she saw it. At the center of the room, standing in the very heart of the space, was a figure. At first, Violet thought it might have been another shadow, a trick of the dim light. But no, it was real, too real. Its form was indistinct, blurred at the edges, as though it were made of smoke or fog. A man, a woman, it was impossible to say. The figure was shrouded in a robe of darkness, the fabric shifting and swirling like it had a mind of its own, constantly changing. The face was hidden, not obscured by shadows but by something else, something deeper, as though the face had never been there to begin with. Violet's breath caught in her throat. She should have turned away. She should have run. But her feet were rooted to the floor, her body frozen by a fear so profound, so deep, that it felt like her soul was being gripped by an icy hand. The figure tilted its head slowly, as if it were aware of her presence, as if it had been waiting for her. And then, without moving, without a sound, it spoke. "You are here, at last." The voice was not a voice at all. It was a presence, a vibration in the air, a feeling that filled the room and seeped into Violet's very bones. It felt familiar, yet wrong, like it came from a place that no living thing could understand. "You do not belong here, Violet, but here you are. And now there is no escaping it." The words were like a hammer, heavy and unyielding. Violet wanted to scream, to run, but her body betrayed her. It was as though the room itself was pressing in on her, its walls closing in, suffocating her. "Do you remember what you've done?" The question echoed in her mind, filling her thoughts like 1,000 voices whispering all at once. She didn't want to answer. She didn't want to think about it. But the figure was relentless. "You sought this. You wanted this." Violet's chest tightened. She had wanted to escape. She had wanted to find answers, to escape the suffocating isolation of her life, to find the truth about the house, about Charles, about the mirror. But she hadn't wanted this thing, this presence, this place that was so far removed from everything she had known, from everything that had once been real. You cannot undo what has been done. You cannot escape. Not now, not ever. Her body trembled, but she couldn't look away. She was drawn in by the figure's presence, by the unrelenting force that seemed to bend reality itself. The air grew colder, the shadows grew darker. And then, as if on cue, the room shifted, and the floor beneath Violet's feet began to move, to change. The walls, once solid, began to breathe, expanding and contracting with the rhythm of the house's pulse. The figure began to move then, but not like a human being. Its limbs stretched impossibly long, each movement jerking and convulsing as though the very fabric of space was warping around it. Its form was no longer solid, but a mass of swirling darkness, an endless void that seemed to devour the light. "You are lost now. You are part of this place, part of the void. There is no way out." The walls around her seemed to close in, as though the house itself were alive, suffocating her. She could feel the darkness reaching for her, its cold fingers creeping along her skin, dragging at her soul. The figure's laughter echoed in her mind, a sound that was both human and alien, like 1,000 voices all laughing in unison. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the room was silent again. The figure was gone, vanished into the darkness. Violet was left standing alone in the shifting, distorted room. But she was not truly alone. The house was with her now. The house was her. Her heart raced as the whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. She wasn't sure where she was anymore. She wasn't sure what was real, but one thing was certain. She was never leaving. Chapter 6. Beneath the surface. The house was alive. Violet could feel it now, crawling beneath her skin like 1,000 spiders, each strand of her hair lifting in response to the house's pulsing energy. It wasn't just a structure, it was something more. It was a vast, breathing entity, a monstrous thing made of wood, stone, and shadows. It moved with a will of its own, its walls shifting, contracting, expanding, as if the house itself had begun to feed on her fear, her confusion, her very being. Every step she took seemed to make the walls close in a little more, like the house was wrapping her in its suffocating embrace. The air was thick, laden with an acrid scent of mold and decay. Violet could taste it on her tongue, sour and bitter, as though she had stepped into the lungs of the house itself. And every time she inhaled, it felt as though she were inhaling something far worse than stale air. It was as if the very atmosphere here held the residue of all the pain and suffering that had been absorbed by the house over the years. It was a strange, heady perfume of sorrow and madness. Time had become irrelevant. She could no longer track the passage of hours or days. The house existed outside of time, its halls stretching infinitely, spiraling like a labyrinth, with no clear beginning and no end. The fog outside the windows had been there so long, it felt like it was part of the house, as though the outside world no longer existed. She had no way of knowing if the sun had risen or set, if there was a day or a night. There was just the house and the unrelenting pulse of it. But the whispers, they were constant now. They started faint, like an unsettling murmur in the back of her mind. But with each passing hour, they grew louder. At first, she thought it was the wind or the house settling, but she soon realized that the whispers were something else entirely. They were voices, low and insistent, brushing against her thoughts like fingers trailing over her skin. She could never make out the words, but she could feel the meaning, the warning, the threat. The voices were telling her something, though she couldn't yet understand it. They were taunting her, mocking her, as if they knew something she didn't. Violet. The voice was soft, seductive, like a whisper in her ear. It was her name, but it didn't sound like her own name. It was distant, warped. It had an edge of something other, something that sent a chill straight down her spine. She had to get out. Every instinct in her screamed at her to turn back, to leave the house, but she couldn't. The house had claimed her. She had chosen it, whether she realized it or not. And now, there was no escape. The corridor of echoes. She moved deeper into the house, her legs heavy with exhaustion. She could feel the walls pressing in around her, but it wasn't just physical. It was psychological too, as though the very air had a weight to it, a gravity that threatened to crush her. Her chest felt tight, and her breath came in shallow gasps, but when she looked down at her hands, they were still steady, too steady. There was no shaking, no outward sign of her inner turmoil, just a growing sense of wrongness that made her question her own thoughts, her own perceptions. Was this real? Was any of this real? A door appeared ahead of her, but it wasn't the same as all the others. This one was different. She could feel it in the air, an unnatural heaviness surrounding it, pulling her toward it like a magnet. The door had no markings, no identifying features, but the air around it shimmered, like a heat haze, like a veil of smoke hanging in the air. Her heart fluttered, but there was no turning back now. She couldn't not open it. Something told her she had to go through, that she had no choice. Her hand trembled as she touched the cold brass knob. It was cool and smooth under her fingers, but it felt like it had been waiting for her, like it had been expecting her to come. and with a slow, almost reluctant movement, she turned it. The door creaked open with a deep, ominous groan, like the sigh of a great beast waking from slumber. She stepped through into the dark room beyond, but the moment she crossed the threshold, something shifted. The air thickened, grew heavier, like a pressure in her chest. The room was not entirely dark, but the light was dim, broken and fractured, like the remnants of a forgotten memory. The forgotten room. Violet's eyes strained against the darkness. She could see shapes, no, shadows, moving along the edges of the room, flickering and warping in and out of her vision. But it wasn't the darkness itself that unsettled her. It was the stillness. The silence was so absolute that it felt unnatural, as if sound had been intentionally erased from the room. Her feet sank into the thick carpet beneath her, the fibers pulling at her shoes as though trying to drag her down. The floor felt wrong, soft in a way that made her uneasy, as if it were not wood but something alive. She took another step forward, her breath catching in her throat, her heart pounding louder than ever before. The walls were lined with mirrors, but they weren't mirrors like the ones she had seen before. These mirrors were alive. Each one reflected something different, something twisted. In one mirror, she saw her own reflection, but it was wrong. Her eyes were black, voids of emptiness that sucked all light into them. Her face was pale, gaunt, as if she had not slept in weeks, her skin drawn tight against her bones. The expression on her face was one of pure terror. She wanted to scream, to move, but she couldn't. She was frozen in place, staring at the reflection of herself trapped in an agony she could not escape. In another mirror, the reflection showed her back, but her hair was moving on its own, twisting in the air like tendrils, reaching out toward her. Violet spun around, but there was nothing behind her. Nothing at all. Was this real? Was she losing her mind? Or was this some cruel trick the house had conjured to torment her? Then, in the last mirror, Violet saw something that made her blood run cold. There, at the far edge of the reflection, standing behind her, was a figure. Tall, lanky, and distorted. Its face was obscured by a mass of shifting shadows, but there was no mistaking its presence. It was watching her, waiting. It moved toward her with an eerie slowness, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, its steps making no sound on the carpet. And the closer it got, the more Violet felt the pull of its gaze. Her breath grew shallow, her chest tightening as though an invisible hand was squeezing her heart. It was drawing closer, closer, until its shadow loomed over her. And then suddenly, the mirrors shattered. The room exploded in a rush of glass, and Violet screamed, her mind reeling as the shards rained down around her. The sound deafening in the enclosed space. She tried to move, tried to run, but the floor beneath her feet seemed to twist, warping like the room itself was alive. The shadows stretched toward her, their dark fingers grabbing at her legs, pulling her down into the floor. But she couldn't move. She was paralyzed, her body held captive by the very house she had entered. It was swallowing her whole, consuming her, and she couldn't escape. The descent. The moment she opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the room with the mirrors. She was standing in a long, narrow hallway, the walls stretching out on either side of her, suffocating her in their closeness. The house felt different now, darker. The air was thicker, denser, like it had grown more sentient with each passing moment, more aware of her presence. The walls seemed to press in around her, the floor shifting beneath her feet with each step, as though the entire house were trying to pull her down into the earth itself. "You are not alone, Violet." The voice was louder now, filling the corridor, growing deeper, more resonant, like it was coming from the walls themselves. "You've come this far, but now there is nowhere left to hide." She wanted to run. She wanted to scream, to break free, but she couldn't. The house had already claimed her, and now it was pulling her deeper into its heart. The door at the end of the hallway was ajar, a faint light spilling out from within. She couldn't explain why, but it felt like the only thing left, the only way out. But when she stepped closer, she saw something else, something worse, a reflection. In the glass, she saw herself standing in the doorway. But this time, she wasn't alone. The figure stood behind her, its long limbs outstretched, its face a shifting blur of shadow. And as Violet stepped forward, the figure followed. Chapter 7. The Hollow Echoes. Violet's pulse thudded in her ears, deafening, drowning out every other sound. The air around her was thick, heavy with something ancient and suffocating, like a fog that clung to the very fabric of her being. It was as if the house had become her entire world. Every creaking floorboard, every rustling whisper, an extension of herself, pulling her deeper into its dark maw. The walls themselves seemed to groan in satisfaction, the house breathing, pulsating with something alive inside it. A consciousness that watched her every move. She couldn't escape it. The house would not let her escape. The door before her stood open, its wooden frame splintered and jagged, as if it had been clawed at by something desperate to get out. A faint light leaked from the cracks between the frame and the wall, casting ghostly shadows on the floor. But the darkness beyond the door felt colder, more alive. It was a place where the air grew still, and time seemed to bend into itself, collapsing in on everything that had ever existed. Violet stepped toward it, her heart racing faster, and with each step, her breathing grew more shallow, more erratic. There was no escaping the pull of the door, and as her trembling hand reached for the knob, she felt a surge of dread. Something wanted her to open it. She had no choice. It was as if the house had chosen her, or perhaps she had already chosen it long ago, before she even realized. Her fingers brushed against the cold brass of the handle, and a jolt of cold shot up her spine. The house was alive, its pulse thrumming beneath her feet, in her veins, in the very core of her thoughts. Every fiber of her being screamed to turn away, but her hand gripped the knob with a force she couldn't control. The door creaked open slowly, groaning on its hinges, the sound of it scraping against the wood like nails on a chalkboard. The darkness beyond it stretched outward, swallowing her in a thick, impenetrable fog, and for a moment, she stood frozen in the doorway, her body trembling. "Come in, Violet." The voice came from somewhere deep within the darkness, a whisper that filled the air like smoke, curling into her lungs. The voice was familiar, but not quite. It sounded like her own, but laced with something unrecognizable, something wrong. She stepped inside. The hallway of forgotten dreams. The moment Violet crossed the threshold, the air shifted. The room, or rather the space, was wrong. There were no windows, no ceiling, no walls. There was only a long hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly, its floor a patchwork of worn wooden boards, their edges splintered, jagged, as if they had been torn apart and hastily pieced together. The hallway had no end, no beginning. It was as if it existed outside of time and space altogether, a place between places. The walls around her were like the skin of the house itself, writhing, breathing. They seemed to pulse with a life of their own, as though they were watching her, waiting. The faint glow of her surroundings flickered intermittently, as though a dying light bulb were struggling to stay alive, casting long, eerie shadows that moved on their own, following her every step. With every step she took, the floorboards groaned underfoot, but Violet could hear something else, a deeper sound, like the low hum of a distant machine, reverberating through her body, thrumming in her bones. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there, always there. "Don't look back," she told herself. "Don't look back. Just keep moving." But it was hard to ignore the feeling that something was behind her. Something that had been following her from the moment she entered the house. Something that knew her, knew everything about her. Every step, every breath, every thought. She turned a corner, and the hallway seemed to stretch even further, twisting in ways that defied logic. The walls closed in around her, the floor narrowing, the air growing thick with suffocating pressure. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but the house had already decided for her. "You're not alone here, Violet." The whisper echoed in her mind again, louder now, a voice that wasn't just heard, but felt. It was inside her, circling in her thoughts, winding through her mind like a serpent, poisoning her sense of self. Not alone. Not alone. Not alone. She looked around, but the hallway was empty. The oppressive darkness seemed to stretch forever, with no other doors or openings, just endless space that pressed in on her from every direction. The house was pushing her forward, but for what? Why? Why had it chosen her? Why was she here? Why did she feel like she was being pulled deeper into some unknown fate that she couldn't outrun? But the room of lost time. Finally, Violet reached the end of the hallway, or at least, she thought it was the end. There, in the distance, she saw another door. This one different from the others. It was not made of wood, but of glass, cracked and distorted, the edges splintered like shattered dreams. A pale light shone through the cracks, as if it were beckoning her, urging her to come closer. She approached the door, her footsteps heavy on the floor, each step resonating like a drumbeat in her chest. Her hand reached for the cold, smooth glass, but as she touched it, the sensation was wrong. It felt alive, the surface slick under her fingers, as if it were breathing in rhythm with her own pulse. A voice came from behind her, and this time it was louder, more insistent. "Violet, come back." The words were not her own. They were a reflection of her mind, twisted, contorted, fractured. But the voice was not a distant whisper anymore. It was as if it was coming from within the very walls themselves, reverberating through her bones. Violet recoiled from the glass, a sudden wave of panic sweeping over her. She spun around, her heart hammering in her chest, but the hallway stretched out in the same endless, suffocating way it had before. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, was now unbearable. She could feel eyes on her from every direction, but there was nothing there. No one there. But it's here. The thought slithered into her mind with such force that it almost made her lose her balance. The house was alive. It had always been alive, feeding off of her fears, her thoughts, her very soul. She had become part of it, a tiny speck in the vast, insidious machinery that churned on in the dark heart of this place. "You can't leave," the voice whispered again. "You've already crossed the line. You belong here now." The words echoed in her mind, and she understood. She knew. She had always known. Even before she had stepped through the front door, the house had chosen her long before she realized. It had been waiting for her, watching her, drawing her in like a moth to a flame. And now, there was no escape. But I can still escape, Violet thought, her mind grasping at something. Anything that could save her from the crushing despair, the overwhelming weight of the house's presence. She pressed her hand against the glass again, harder this time. The coldness seeped through her fingers, sending a jolt of icy energy up her arm, and for a moment, she felt something break, like the first crack in a dam holding back a flood of water. The glass shattered, but instead of falling to the floor, it opened. The abyss within Violet stepped through the opening, and instantly, she was no longer in the hallway. She was in a vast, empty space, a room the size of a cathedral, its ceiling lost to shadows. The air was thick with dust, and the floor beneath her feet was cracked and uneven, as though it had been abandoned for centuries. The room seemed to stretch on forever, the walls far too distant for her to make out any detail. The moment she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, the sound reverberating through her entire body. The room was cold, so cold that it burned. It wasn't just the temperature, it was wrong. The cold seeped into her skin, into her bones, as though the room was draining the warmth from her very soul. And then, the shadows moved. They were not just shadows, they were figures, humanoid shapes that flickered in and out of the corners of her vision, shifting like smoke, like liquid darkness. They whispered in low, guttural tones, their voices indistinct but full of malice, full of promises of something terrible, something final. Violet felt a chill race down her spine as one of the figures stepped closer, its presence suffocating, a weight in the air. Its eyes, black and empty, locked onto hers. And for the first time since she entered the house, she realized she was not alone. She was surrounded. The figure raised its hand and the air itself seemed to freeze, a silence so profound it was deafening. And in that silence, Violet heard it. The truth. She was never meant to leave. Chapter 8. The Unraveling. Violet stood motionless, her limbs stiff, her mind adrift. The silence of the room pressed in on her like a physical force, thick and suffocating. The shadows, those dark, formless things that had followed her through the house, now surrounded her, closing in tighter with each breath she took. They were not just shadows. They were something older, something darker, and they were waiting for her to break. Her eyes darted nervously from one corner of the room to the other. It was no longer clear whether the room was shifting around her, or whether it was her mind bending reality, twisting everything into grotesque shapes. The walls stretched and buckled like paper in the rain, the ceiling sagging low, as if it too were closing in on her. The light, if it could even be called that, flickered like a dying candle, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. Everywhere she looked, there was darkness. The darkness filled the spaces between the walls, the cracks in the floorboards, the very air she breathed. It was alive, she realized, alive and watching, waiting, and it was drawing closer, closer until she couldn't escape it. The figures, those strange, hollow things, were standing at the edges of her vision, not moving but always there, like whispers just out of reach. Their shapes twisted and contorted, their edges blurring into nothingness. They were not human, not really. They were fragments of something else, memories perhaps, or pieces of forgotten nightmares. Violet could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their gaze 1,000 times heavier than it should have been. Their eyes were empty, yet somehow they were watching, staring, probing her soul. Violet. The voice came again, low and guttural, but now it felt different. No longer a whisper in her mind. It was an invasive presence, sharp, jagged, like nails scraping down a chalkboard. Her name echoed through her skull, reverberating within her very bones. It was no longer a call. It was a command. Come closer. The words were not spoken aloud, yet they filled her mind, settled into the deepest corners of her thoughts, as if they had always been there, waiting to emerge. She could feel it, feel the power in those words, as if the very air around her pulsed with them, heavy with their weight. Come closer. She stumbled back, shaking her head, but it was no use. Her feet wouldn't move. Her body wouldn't respond. She wanted to scream, but the words were trapped inside her chest, her throat a dry, aching void. The air around her thickened, pressing in on her, each breath a struggle. This is what it wants, she realized with a sickening clarity. This is what it's been waiting for. The house was alive. It wasn't just an inanimate structure, an old, decaying shell of a building. No, this place had a soul, twisted, dark and hungry. The shadows, the whispers, the creeping sense of dread, they were all part of it, all extensions of the house's will, feeding on her fear, growing stronger with each moment she spent here. Her mind swirled, fragments of thoughts and images crashing into one another. The walls closed in tighter, the air growing colder, suffocating. She could no longer tell if she was seeing the room as it was, or if it was warping before her eyes, bending and shifting in a cruel mockery of reality. The floor beneath her feet creaked, and for a moment, Violet thought she heard something moving, a faint scraping sound, like claws dragging across wood. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The darkness shifted, and suddenly the figures, those twisted, nightmarish shapes, began to move, but not in the way she expected. They moved in unison. Like a tide of blackness, they surged forward, their movements synchronized in a way that was both unnerving and hypnotic. They seemed to be getting closer with every blink, closing the gap between them and her. Violet's heart hammered in her chest. Her legs, still immobile, refused to cooperate. She was trapped. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all seemed to pulse, to throb, as if they were alive, responding to the dark forces within the house. A shape emerged from the crowd of shadows, taller than the rest. Its outline was vaguely human, but its proportions were distorted, impossibly long and thin. It moved with an unsettling fluidity. its body shifting in ways that defied natural law. It loomed over Violet, its face, or what might have been a face, hidden in shadow. But she could feel its gaze, the weight of it pressing down on her like an iron shackle. "You can't escape," the figure rasped, its voice low, a deep, unnatural growl that made her bones ache. "You're already here. You've always been here." Violet recoiled as if struck, the words hammering into her skull. Always been here? The thought made her dizzy. She shook her head, trying to clear the fog from her thoughts, but it was no use. The room seemed to spin, warping into something grotesque. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she wasn't sure if the figure was real, or if it was just another twisted reflection of her shattered mind. "You were always meant for this," the figure continued, its voice now a chorus of whispers, overlapping and indistinct. "You belong here, just as the others did, just as the ones before you did." "No," Violet gasped, her voice hoarse. She tried to push back, to run, but the shadows closed in around her. The walls grew taller, the ceiling sinking lower, as if the house itself was collapsing, shrinking in on her. Her breath was coming in ragged gasps now, each inhale a struggle, each exhale a desperate plea for escape. But there was no escape. The figure reached out, its long skeletal fingers brushing against her skin. The touch was cold, colder than anything she had ever felt, and Violet gasped, her body trembling with the icy shock. The coldness spread through her, coursing through her veins, freezing her blood until she was numb. Her limbs were heavy, unresponsive. She couldn't breathe. The darkness closed in around her like a vice, and she felt herself slipping away, falling into something far worse than death, into a place where time had no meaning, where reality twisted and bent like a broken reflection. She had crossed the threshold. She was no longer just in the house. She was part of it now. "You were always here," the figure repeated, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "You were always part of the house. You were never meant to leave. This is where you belong." And then, everything stopped. The silence was deafening. For what felt like an eternity, Violet stood there, her mind a swirling vortex of confusion and terror, trying to make sense of the words, the whispers, the horrors she had seen. The figures were gone. The shadows were still. The room, once alive with malevolent energy, was now completely still. But Violet knew. She knew the truth now. She was trapped, not just in the house, but in time itself. This house was a place of endless loops, of lives consumed and forgotten, of souls lost and swallowed whole. And she was one of them. Her mind shattered under the weight of that knowledge, and for the first time, Violet understood the depth of her entrapment. This wasn't a house. It was a tomb for those who had wandered too far into its grip, and she was now part of its cursed history, another soul to be consumed, lost in the endless dark. With a final strangled scream, Violet fell to her knees, her body trembling as the house claimed her completely. Chapter 9. The Mirror of Despair. Violet woke to an overwhelming darkness, a suffocating absence that enveloped her as if the world had ceased to exist outside of her. The air was still, yet there was a sense of movement, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that made her feel as though something was breathing beside her, waiting for her to awaken, to face whatever nightmare it had prepared. Her eyes, heavy with exhaustion and fear, struggled to focus in the pitch-black room. Yet it felt as though the shadows themselves were pressing against her eyelids, forbidding her to see clearly. She tried to move, but her limbs felt like lead, each joint aching as though the very act of existing had become a monumental effort. Her body screamed at her to get up, but her mind was too fogged with exhaustion, terror, and confusion. Was she awake? Was this real? Or had she crossed over into some twisted realm between sleep and wakefulness, a place where reality and nightmare bled together into an indistinguishable mess? Her throat was dry, and her chest felt tight, as if an invisible weight were crushing her lungs. She tried to inhale deeply, but the air tasted stale, metallic, as though it had been poisoned by something ancient and evil that had been festering in the very walls of the house. Violet could feel the oppressive weight of the place pressing down on her, the house itself alive with some insidious force, a malevolent presence that made her skin crawl. She pushed herself to sit up, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold, damp floor. The floorboards creaked beneath her, as if the house was alive, aware of her every movement. The walls seemed to shift in the corners of her vision, warping like a mirage, distorting the space around her. Was she going mad? Or was the house truly bending reality, twisting it like a piece of paper being crumpled and torn? And then she heard it. A whisper, soft at first, like the wind rustling through dead leaves. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but Violet could feel it inside her mind, curling around her thoughts, tugging at the edges of her consciousness. Violet. Her name. It was a whisper, but it carried with it a weight, a force that made her skin prickle with fear. The voice was not unfamiliar, though it sounded distant, as if it were coming from somewhere deep within the house. Somewhere far away, but that was impossible. She was alone. There was no one here but her. Come closer. The voice lingered in her mind, beckoning her, pulling at her thoughts like a string being tugged from the other side. She felt the compulsion, a force stronger than any will of her own, pushing her forward, urging her to follow the voice, to give in. It was not a suggestion. It was a command. Violet shook her head, desperately trying to shake off the fog that clouded her thoughts. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her, weak and trembling. The floor seemed to shift beneath her feet, as though the very foundation of the house was shifting, groaning under the weight of something far darker than she could comprehend. The walls stretched and contracted, pulling her into the heart of the house, as though the house itself were alive, feeding on her fear, drawing her into its suffocating embrace. She could feel the shadows now. They were everywhere, not just on the walls, not just in the corners, but in the very air, curling around her like tendrils of smoke. The darkness was not an absence of light. It was alive. It was watching her, listening, waiting. The shadows were no longer mere figures lurking in the background. They had become an active part of the house, weaving their way into the fabric of her mind. And then she saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping out from the darkness with a fluidity that was both unsettling and unnatural. It was tall, impossibly tall, its outline a distorted shape that seemed to shift and warp with every blink. It moved toward her slowly, its long limbs bending in ways that defied logic, stretching and curling as though it existed in multiple dimensions at once. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a void, an empty blackened mask that seemed to suck the very light from the room. No eyes, no features, just a hollow emptiness. Violet froze, her blood running cold in her veins. The air felt thick, heavy, suffocating. The figure didn't speak, but Violet could hear it in her mind, its voice whispering to her from the depths of her subconscious, sliding into her thoughts like a serpent. You've come far, Violet. The words didn't need to be spoken aloud. They vibrated in her chest, resonating deep within her bones, and she understood them without thinking. It was as if the figure had always known her, had always been waiting for her. It had been there all along, watching, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. You were always meant to be here. The figure's voice was calm, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. There was no malice in it, only a deep, chilling indifference, as if it had seen countless souls like hers come and go. It didn't care whether she lived or died. She was just another part of the house, another cog in the endless machinery of its existence. The walls around her seemed to pulse, throb, as if the house itself was alive, breathing, listening. Violet could feel the floor beneath her feet shudder, and for a moment it felt as though the very ground had turned to liquid, as though she were standing on the edge of some vast abyss, staring into the blackened depths. You are part of it now, the figure continued, its voice reverberating in the air. You always have been. The house knows you. It knows all of us. And we know you, Violet. We are one. The shadows surged forward, closing in on her. Violet stumbled back, but the floor was now slick with something cold and wet. The walls reached out with skeletal hands, their fingers curling around her like chains. The house was alive, and it was drawing her deeper into its grasp. The figure stepped forward, its form becoming clearer now, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. Its face, or the absence of one, hovered just inches from hers, and she could feel its cold breath against her skin. "There is no escape," it whispered, the words wrapping around her mind like a vice. "You are already part of it. You were always meant to be part of it. You will never leave this place." Violet's heart hammered in her chest as she fought against the invisible forces pulling her deeper into the house. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body was no longer her own. It was as though the house had consumed her, had seeped into her very being, until there was no separation between her and the dark entity that inhabited it. The line between herself and the house had blurred, and there was no longer any distinction. She was the house was her. She could feel her own thoughts twisting, unraveling, as the house tore through her mind like a predator tearing at its prey. The memories of her past, of who she had been, were fading, slipping away like water through her fingers. Everything she had once known, everything she had once been, was being consumed, swallowed by the darkness, absorbed into the very bones of the house. "You are nothing without us," the figure whispered, its voice wrapping around her like chains. "You were always ours. You will never leave. This is where you belong." And Violet understood. She understood the horror of it now. The house was not just a place. It was a trap. It was not a home, not a sanctuary, but a tomb, a prison for souls, an endless cycle of consumption and decay. Once you entered, you never left. And Violet had entered. She had always entered. She had always been part of it. Her mind screamed, her body trembled, but there was no escape. The house was her, and she was the house. Chapter 10. The Eternal House. Violet awoke to silence. At first it felt like peace, but it was a silence of a different kind, unnatural, all-encompassing. It was as if the house itself had inhaled deeply, holding its breath, waiting. There was no sound, no creaking of the floorboards, no whispering of the walls, no wind howling through broken windows. Only this unnatural stillness, thick and suffocating, as if even time itself had frozen in place. For a moment, she thought she had escaped. Perhaps it had all been a nightmare, a horrible, endless dream. Perhaps she was back in her old life, back in the world she had once known, before the house had dragged her into its suffocating depths. But when she opened her eyes, she saw only darkness, the same oppressive, murky blackness that had followed her since the moment she stepped into this cursed place. The darkness that had become her constant companion, pressing in on her from all sides, wrapping itself around her until she could no longer tell where she ended and the shadows began. She moved her hands, but they felt wrong. Not her own. They were too cold, too stiff, as if they were something else, something alien. Her fingers trembled, but the tremors felt distant, as if they came from someone else. The very air around her seemed to hum with energy, and she could feel it vibrating through her skin, through her bones, as though the house itself was alive and watching her, waiting for her next move. Her chest tightened. Panic began to rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down, her mind cloudy with confusion. She pushed herself upright, but the world around her felt off balance, as if the floor was slanting, shifting beneath her feet. The walls seemed to stretch out in impossible directions, folding in on themselves, bending in ways they shouldn't. She stumbled forward, unsure of her own body, as if she were walking in a dream, her legs stiff and uncooperative. Her surroundings were a blur. The house seemed to be playing tricks on her, warping and distorting in ways that made her question if she was truly awake. Was she dreaming? Was she still trapped in that cycle of nightmares, where nothing was ever quite real? But then the whispers began, soft at first, so faint she could almost dismiss them as a trick of her mind. But they persisted, growing louder with each passing second, filling the air with a cold, distant hum that gnawed at her sanity. They were not words, not at first. Just sounds, scratching, scraping, like something dragging itself across the floor, or like 1,000 insects scuttling in the dark. She closed her eyes, pressed her hands to her ears, but the sound burrowed into her thoughts, became a part of her, slipping through the cracks of her mind, forcing her to listen. "Violet." The voice was soft, distant, yet unmistakable. It felt like a presence, more than a mere sound. It came from deep within the house, as though the house itself were speaking to her, breathing its whispers into her soul. Violet. Her name again, but this time there was a weight to it, a command. She could feel it in her chest, the pull of it. Something was beckoning her. She couldn't explain why, but she knew. She knew that she had to follow. Her body moved before she could stop it, her feet taking slow, deliberate steps toward the center of the room, though her mind screamed for her to turn away. The house was guiding her, like a puppet master pulling her strings. Her limbs felt like they belonged to someone else, moving without her permission, against her will. She didn't want to go, didn't want to give in, but there was something in her, something deep inside her, that compelled her to obey. And then she saw it. The mirror, a large, old-fashioned mirror, its surface cracked and tarnished, standing in the center of the room like a sentinel, watching her. At first, Violet hesitated. She knew better than to look into mirrors in this house. She had learned that lesson early on, but there was something about it. Something about the way it called to her that made her step closer, despite every instinct screaming at her to run. Her reflection appeared in the glass, but it was wrong, distorted. The woman staring back at her was not her. The eyes were hollow, dark pits where there had once been warmth, and the face was pale, almost grey, as if drained of life. Her lips were stretched into a thin, unnatural smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. But the most unsettling thing of all was the way the reflection moved. It wasn't quite in sync with her. It blinked when she didn't, grinned when she didn't smile. It was as though the mirror had become a separate entity, one that reflected something far darker than what she had ever known. "Come closer," the voice whispered again, now filling her mind entirely, drowning out everything else. "Closer, Violet. It's time." The mirror seemed to grow, stretching out, its surface warping, distorting as if it were pulling her in. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and the moment her hand touched the glass, the world around her seemed to shudder. A pulse, like a heartbeat, echoed through the house. The floor trembled beneath her, and the walls groaned, as if the house itself were alive, shaking in anticipation. She had crossed a threshold. The moment her fingers met the glass, the mirror opened. A cold, clammy feeling enveloped her hand, creeping up her arm like icy tendrils. She gasped, her chest tightening with a sharp, jagged breath. The reflection in the mirror stared at her now. No longer an imitation, but something else. It was alive. Its mouth opened in a silent scream, and Violet felt her own throat tighten, as if her voice were being choked out by the very air around her. "You were always meant to come here," the voice murmured again, this time not from the house, but from inside her, deep within her mind, speaking through her own thoughts. "You are a part of it. The house has claimed you, and now you are ours, forever." Her fingers dug into the glass, the surface cold and slick under her touch. She tried to pull away, but the mirror held her, pulling her in, drawing her deeper. It wasn't just a reflection, it was a doorway, a portal to something far darker, far older than anything she could have imagined. The darkness was swallowing her, consuming her thoughts, her identity. She felt herself being pulled in, her body sliding toward the mirror, no longer under her own control. "You are nothing without us," the voice hissed, louder now, echoing in her ears, in her very soul. "You were always ours. You will never leave." Her body moved against her will, her legs stumbling forward, and in one swift motion, she was sucked into the mirror, her body consumed by the cold, endless blackness that swirled within it. It felt like falling through an endless void, weightless and disoriented. Time seemed to stretch and distort, bending in ways that defied understanding. There was no up, no down, just the cold, suffocating darkness. And then, just as suddenly, the world snapped back into place. Violet found herself standing in the center of the room again. The mirror was gone. The walls were back to their familiar, oppressive stillness. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't peaceful. It was final. She looked around, but there was no sense of the outside world anymore. She didn't feel the same. She didn't feel anything at all, not in the way she used to. The house had changed her. It had claimed her, absorbed her, and now she was one with it. The walls weren't just walls anymore. They were her bones. The air wasn't just air, it was her breath. The house had become part of her, and she part of it. There was no Violet left. There was only the house, and the house was forever. Her mind spiraled, but there was no escape, no return. She was lost, but she had always been lost, hadn't she? From the very beginning, she had belonged to this place. She had always belonged to the darkness, the house that never let go. And now she would never leave. The last of her humanity faded away, absorbed into the eternal, ever-changing labyrinth of the house. Her name was forgotten. The world outside no longer mattered. She was part of the house now, its walls, its floors, its darkness, its eternal whispers, and she would stay here forever. Epilogue. Forever lost. There was no end, only the infinite echo of her name. Violet, the name that had once belonged to a woman, flesh and bone, now twisted into a mere whisper, a memory that lingered within the walls, never truly fading. The house had absorbed everything, her thoughts, her soul, her very essence. In its darkness her name echoed, but it was no longer her name. It was a call, an invitation, an eternal reminder of what had been lost. The house had claimed her, and it had left no trace behind. It had consumed her, piece by piece, until she was no longer a person, but a part of the house, a fragment of its decaying heart. The rooms, the halls, the very floorboards now pulsed with her presence. But it was not the Violet who had first stepped inside, filled with dread and uncertainty. No, this was something else, something darker, something far more ancient. From the outside, the house appeared unchanged. Its walls still stood tall against the horizon, its windows cracked, its doors broken. To the world beyond its reach, it was nothing more than a forgotten relic, a decaying structure on the edge of a forgotten town. But inside, it was alive. Alive with the memories of those who had been trapped there, those who had wandered in and never returned. And now, Violet was among them. No longer a single entity, she had merged with the house itself. The house had taken her, as it had taken so many others before her. She was a shadow now, a whisper in the dark, flickering just out of reach, but always present, always watching. Those who dared to step into the house, those who dared to listen to its whispers, would feel her. They would hear her, lost in the wind that crept through the broken windows, or in the soft scraping sound that came from the walls at night. They would feel her in the cold spots, the shifting air, the oppressive weight that pressed against their chests, suffocating them as they explored its endless rooms. And for those who ventured too far, who stayed too long, who listened, the house would claim them too, just as it had claimed Violet. It would feed on their fear, their confusion, their broken minds. It would tear their souls apart, piece by piece, until nothing remained but a hollow echo of their existence. Until they too became part of the house. Nothing more than fragments, memories, whispers that could never escape. There was no way out, no escape. Once you were part of the house, you could never leave. It would never let you go. It would consume you. You would become its own. And Violet? Violet was gone. There was no more her. She had been lost to the house, but she had also become one with it. The dark, twisting corridors that stretched into infinity. Those were her now. The shifting shadows, the whispers in the dark. Those were her voice now. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the walls, every flicker of cold air. Those were her movements, her breath, her essence. She was the house now. There would be no rest. There would be no salvation. She would watch forever, bound in an endless loop of darkness and madness. She would never be free, but she would also never be alone, because in the house you were never alone, you were always watched, always felt. The house had claimed her, and in return, it would never let her go. As the years passed, the house stood as it always had, silent, dark, waiting. The trees around it grew twisted, gnarled, as if they too were trying to escape the house's grasp, but they could not. They were part of it, just as Violet was. And for anyone who came after her, Those who thought they could survive where others had failed, the house would reach out like a hungry hand and pull them into its endless dark. It would whisper their names, it would call them, and it would take them, just as it had taken Violet. End of the story.